Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I can't believe how comfortable I am without 2 layers of thermal underwear. I do miss it though. Heston, next year. If I may encroach on your presentation, we did have an opportunity to put a whole lot of impala into a forced thicket enclosure, because of course they tend to move out of the thicket in places like Shamwari. So there is some data on, and they're not quite the same as goats, if I may defend the impala. I want to start by thanking Shamwari for allowing me to do what I please. It's always good to have friends in high places or expensive places. And it also happens to be an interesting place in terms of thicket mosaics. And I'm keeping a half an eye on Adrian at the back there, because I'm going to pull the duck out under, no, the pond out under the duck, sorry, I got the back to front, today. And it's not only Adrian. I had a student several years ago, Elizabeth Meyer-Milne, who considered thicket mosaics of a certain type, Bontveld ones, Karoo, anything from fynbos through to succulent Karoo and Osterveld thicket mosaics. And I'll show you the map in Thursday's presentation. I don't want to steal that thunder. But thicket mosaics, we expected would have the mosaic that is different, obviously, and the mosaic component is from another biome or biomes, but the important thing is the thicket clump, or bush clumps as we have been calling them. And the assumption in all of our minds, and to a large extent Betsy supported that, is that the matrix of the other biomes, of course, is, over the thicket domain, is vastly different from one site to another, but that the bush clumps are pretty much thicket. Okay, so the bush clumps, and we know thicket has, solid thicket anyway, has low beta diversity, so each bush clump should have all the elements as expected of thicket. Bontveld, just for those of you who haven't been at Thicket Forum over the years, Bontveld is a name that was coined by the Eastern Cape farmers to describe this mosaic, where there is, for argument's sake, grasses in the matrix and they can graze there, but the thicket clumps stay untouched by their grazing animals. So the term Bontveld then came to mean that the matrix would be complex, as opposed to just a simple thicket mosaic. So that's the sort of background of the difference between the two terms, and in the step process that occurred at this university some years back now, the decision was to make it 2 or more biomes must have elements in Bontveld, whereas there's sort of one biome that sits with the thicket clumps in the other thicket mosaics. A little bit of history. The very first presentation on Bontveld is by Eileen Archibald. You talk about history, Alistair. It's so hard. I just missed being able to actually meet with her and chat to her. She developed Alzheimer's in her later life, and her daughter said, "You're welcome to come and visit, but I don't think we'll manage." She described a thing called Bontveld in the Addo Elephant National Park. You will notice this date is 55. This is her map out of the same paper. And she described Bontveld, for those of you who, there we go. For those of you who know Addo, this is Sierkop up here. So you come up the hill from main camp up here, and then if you drive through these areas here are Bontveld, red soils, deep soils, bush clumps in a matrix of mostly grass. Up here, this area has calcrete, a calcrete substrate, and she referred to that as mixed shrub and grassland, and that leads us into the Calcrete Bontveld concept, where we have a matrix of dwarf shrubs and grass. So if I look at the same view, but using a Google Earth image, we have the Calcrete Bontveld up here, and these areas are Archibald Bontveld, and I'm going to call it Archibald Bontveld to differentiate it. Please note that they are, you can almost spit from one into the other. They are close to each other. In Shamwari, we have an opportunity to get even closer. You can very clearly see this is a small tributary of the river up here, and you can very clearly see, why don't I have a, there we go. You can clearly see the Calcrete Bontveld on the one side and the so-called Archibald Bontveld on the other. I'm not, it's pale. Okay. So that's two of the types of mosaic, and they are close to each other, so you can exclude climatic differences, and that's useful. And then we also have other mosaics, two other mosaics in the southern part of Shamwari. This, just for those of you who know the area, is the the map is several years old. Shamwari is expanding quite extensively at the moment. In this, we have this area that I showed you just now is down here, where you have Archibald Bontveld and Calcrete Bontveld right next to each other. Then we also have, the green is thicket, valley thicket. Then we also have an entity called Nanaga Savanna Thicket, and some Grahamstown Grassland Thicket just comes in over here, the pale yellow. So close together, we have 4 different mosaic types. We can exclude regional differences because they're so close together. So we measured 15 pairs of bushclump matrix combinations in the 4 types, and I'm going to use this terminology, if you will allow me: Archibald Bontveld, Calcrete Bontveld, Grahamstown Grassland Thicket, and Nanaga Savanna Thicket. So the top 2 are Bontveld, so the matrix has grass and dwarf shrubs, often even of fynbos origin. The grassland thicket, the matrix is a grass. And of course, in savanna, we have Vachellia karoo trees dotted around the matrix. So these are a few images of the bush clumps of these different types. They're not all from Shamwari, just to show you that they are elsewhere. You can see the sea in the background. This is Kucha, the Kucha Industrial Development Zone. Grahamstown Grassland Thicket's kind of obviously grassy. And the Nanaga Savanna Thicket. And in Shamwari, if you're unsure where the Nanaga Savanna Thicket is, go to where the giraffe are. They recognize home without having to walk all the way back across the Orange River. So these paired samples we took, and we also measured the distance from the bush clump to the nearest Vachellia Carew shrub. I don't know about trees anywhere here. They're all about yay size. Maybe a few. The taller ones are in the riparian zone, not in the matrix. In 4 directions. So at each bush clump, we measured the distance to the nearest 4 in the quadrants around the clump. And just to prove to you that that the bush clumps and the matrix have nothing to do with each other, as I always do at Thicket Forum, the same applies here. So let's start with the matrix. This is what we expect to be very different, and to a large extent it is. Now, if I can just quickly go back to the map, I just want to point out the Archibald Bontveld and Calcrete Bontveld are down here in this area. The Grahamstown Grassland Thicket is up there, and then all this sort of olive brown is Nanaga Savanna Thicket. So as we expected, as I expected, Calcrete Bontveld's very different. And I think I've probably done that to death at Thicket Forum, so I'm not going to say too much more. Shallow soils, sandy soils, a mixture of fynbos, grass, and Carew dwarf shrubs in the matrix, and that's why it sits over here. The Archibald Bontveld, which remember is right next to the Calcrete Bontveld. I showed you the aerial image of that. That sits right on top of the ordination space for the Grahamstown Grassland Thicket. A bit surprising. And then the Savannah part of the Savannah Thicket sits between them. What I didn't expect, one can of course use this type of approach. For those of you who don't do this kind of work, you can use this type of approach to figure out what species are important in each of them. Please note that the Grahamstown Grassland Thicket and Archibald Bontveld, there's a lot of taxa in there on that side. That's why they're all written on top of each other. So there's a lot, it's species rich. And so for matrix comparisons, you don't have to read the list. Calcrete Bontveld, as predicted, highly diverse, and I've only put up until 2% of the vegetation here. Savanna Thicket in the matrix is also quite diverse, but you'll notice that the Archibald Bontveld and the Grassland Thicket, and that's why they sit on top of each other, is because they are completely overwhelmingly dominated by a couple of grasses. Thankfully, Themeda triandra, which is rooigras, or a sweet, palatable grass, Spirobolus fimbriatus as well. But I mean, those are all grasses up there. So, highly diverse in the Bontveld and the Savanna Thicket matrix, not so much in the other two. Now for the bush clumps, and this is where the dam gets pulled out under the duck. Betsy could not, using any vegetation classification from acox through to steppe, she could not separate cogent bush clump associations. So even the bush clumps in Calcrete Bontveld are different. The Nanaga Savanna Thicket is the other one that's different. This is pretty close for a, there we go. This is pretty close for an ordination, so I'm not too concerned about that. The Nanaga Savanna Thicket is an issue though. You will notice You will notice the high diversity in the Calcrete Bontveld bushclumps. The Archibald Bontveld also has high diversity in the bushclumps. You can pick out your favorites. This, though, is a problem. The Nanaga Savanna Thicket bushclumps only had 1 or 2 taxa, and the 2 taxa, having measured 487 bushclumps for dominant taxa, I found one that had 1% that were Schotia afra, and I don't know if you want to call this a bushclump. That's a picture. I was generous. An azema bushclump and 90%, 95% azema, and Cercia guernsey in the left. I'm not sure that this is thicket. You can play with all the different components. You will notice that at least we do have in the matrix, the Savanna thicket has every 25 meters, there's a Vachelia Karoo. And just to point out that this is not really, none of these, oddly enough, have much Portulacaria afra. I found one bush clump in the Savanna thicket. There's the Portulacaria afra here. The vehicles, the game watching vehicles ride over the edges here. This is right next to a road. So what do we do now? We clearly do not have a full handle on thicket mosaics, and much more work remains to be done. Not sure that the Nanaga Savanna Thicket is, that those clumps are actually thicket clumps. I think they are big shrubs. But I'm happy to hear your experience and advice.